Tom Singers previously served as the Senior Policy Advisor for the Western Environmental Law Center and is an Energy Program Senior Advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, where he led the team that published Leaking Profits, a seminal work on reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Dr. Singer has also served as the Director of Research for the Western Governors Association, as Energy Policy Analyst for governors and legislative committees in Alaska, and as a graduate level international business professor. He holds a BA from Harvard University and an MBA from Stanford, and a PhD in international business from George Washington University. This is a long way around saying that I think Tom is more than qualified to address the issues we're going to talk about tonight. And that is the existential question: is New Mexico effectively regulating the oil and gas industry's methane emissions? So Tom, in 20 words or less, can you answer that question for us?
20 slides or less. Shall I go ahead and share the?
Yes, why don't you take it away? That's great.
I want to thank 350 for inviting me to do this. It is absolutely a labor of love. Leaking Profits was published by NRDC in 2012, and I've been at this every year, since then. The work is never done. And I want to thank everybody who's on for joining. I'm going to go slowly because I'm really trying to tell a story that I know well, and I want to make sure that everybody is following. So we're talking about the methane emissions problem. What do we know? Early in her very first term, her third executive order, the governor established state greenhouse gas emissions goals. And in doing state greenhouse gas inventories, it became very clear that oil and gas operations are the biggest contributor to New Mexico's greenhouse gas. Well, second, besides transportation, but the largest industrial contributor to New Mexico's greenhouse gas emissions. And so, forever, the question has been, what do we know about how the industry is doing to reduce their emissions, particularly since the governor's EO? And should these goals ever be enshrined in statute, how are we going to know how we're doing? Here's the governor's executive order, 2019-03. The fundamental goal here was to achieve statewide reductions in GHGs of at least 45% by 2030 as compared to the 2005 levels. This is a pie chart from the inventory. So this is even though it is now 25, when they did this, they were forecasting emissions for 2025. And these are estimates. I'll talk about the inventory later in the slideshow. But this is the estimated oil and gas. This is the whole statewide emissions, but the orange and peach color, the burnt orange and peach color, are the oil and gas methane and CO2 emissions, which represent 38% of New Mexico's GHGs. So it's very important to get grounded in this conversation that according to the inventory, methane, and these numbers are on a CO2e basis. So according to the inventory, it's really carbon dioxide combustion products that is more significant in the oil and gas industry than methane, raw methane. I have my doubts about that, but these are the official inventory numbers. So oil and gas methane is 11% of statewide GHGs. CO2 is 27% of statewide GHGs. The total is 38%. It's down from like 53% a couple of inventories ago. And of course, the question is, what can we do about this? What can the oil and gas industry and we do about this? And I'll talk more about the CO2 emissions later. Another slide from the inventory. They update the inventory periodically as they have funding. And they did an update recently to the baseline year, which is '05, and concluded that methane emissions were even higher. So you can see the right-hand bar is got more emissions than the left-hand bar. That was the original, and the right hand is the new. So we need to get even more reductions out of all of the sectors, including oil and gas, which is again the flesh color in the orange, to meet the statewide GHG goal. This is one of the most critical slides. Really need to be grounded in this. The state is not on track to meet the executive order's goal. And the last two bars of this chart show the 2030 current trajectory, given what the assumptions in the inventory are about where oil and gas and other, I'm going to focus on oil and gas, of course, where oil and gas pollution, GHG pollution is coming from. What kind of controls does the existing regulatory scheme and enforcement get us in 2030? It's 32% below '05. The last bar, what they call the mitigation scenario, is forced to meet 45% below. So at the last iteration of this inventory, we're not on track. We're not there. We're not getting there. What are we going to do? And that's kind of what I'll be talking about. So you may have noticed in September, and I'm not here to slam the governor, I'm just kind of stating the facts. The governor had a press release, and it was, reported in the papers in September that New Mexico has slashed their emissions. And I want to talk, part of what I'm going to cover here is what that was really about. But the press conference was that New Mexico had slashed emissions by half compared to Texas, and there's money in it, state revenue. So the administration, when they're talking about slashing emissions, was talking about relative emissions. And in my opinion, it's absolute emissions that matter. So I'm just going to quote the press release. New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan-Grisham on Monday announced new satellite data showing New Mexico's methane rules cut oil and gas facility emissions in the Permian by half compared to neighboring Texas. That is, New Mexico's intensity was 1.2%, Texas is 3.1. And methane intensity is a measure of the amount of natural gas that escapes into the atmosphere during production relative to total output. I'm going to go off script a little bit and just say the industry loves the intensity metric, and you'll see why in the next two slides. I love it less so. Yeah. So neither the amount of methane emissions nor the total oil and gas production used for the emissions intensity calculation were disclosed by the administration in their press release. The data I understand, was provided by EDF, and I've been so far unable to find the data from EDF yet, but I'm on it. I'm looking into it. But the formula is simple. Total emissions divided by total production is 1.2%. So my complaint about emissions intensity isn't to deny that New Mexico is probably doing better than Texas, and that while Texas production may be growing at a similar rate to New Mexico's, let's just say that's true, emissions probably aren't declining at the same rate in Texas as they are in New Mexico. And that's probably due, at least in part, to our methane rules, which, full disclosure, I worked a lot on with Jim and Tom in 2021 and thereafter. So the point is that intensity does not measure the reductions in emissions that are needed to meet the state goals. And here's a chart from EIA of New Mexico production out to about middle of this year. Maybe it's a little bit of a forecast. So with production growing far outpacing emissions growth, reductions in intensity are pretty easy to achieve. You've got a fixed numerator and a booming denominator. So the key to how's New Mexico doing and what needs to happen is to meet the state's goal, oil and gas methane emissions need to drop from about 40 million metric ton CO2e to 15. And I'm just going to go back a slide for a second so you can see where those numbers came from. This slide, okay, the left-hand scale is million metric tons, okay? And the '05 number is 40, and the mitigation scenario is 15. So that's where these numbers come from the inventory. They're the best numbers we have. They're probably not very good. But these are the absolute reductions that we really need to be focused on, notwithstanding methane intensity headlines. So who measures oil and gas methane emissions and why? Oil and gas companies, of course, primarily for operations, and not all of them. The graphic here is a SCADA system. I forget what SCADA stands for, but it's a highly sophisticated wireless data gathering and delivery system. And of course, all the majors and super majors have very sophisticated SCADA systems. And if they're looking at methane, the right-hand side of this graphic are where the sensors would be on equipment, tanks, flares, pipelines, et cetera, that would be measuring methane emissions and entering it into their data systems. Who else measures methane emissions? Government regulators sometimes go out in the field, sometimes with measurement devices. They require reporting, and I'll be talking about that a lot. They don't do a lot of independent measurement except by remote sensing technology. I'll touch on that. And then, of course, NGOs like Earthworks and EDF and others are doing sort of independent verification kind of measurement. So how are they measured or estimated? And measurement involves inspectors, monitors, drones, aircraft, satellites. There's also a lot of estimation going on. There's so many little gizmos in the oil patch, in the equipment, from the well site to the gathering and boosting stations, to the compression stations, to the natural gas processing plants, all along that production chain, tremendous amounts of equipment. So for a lot of that equipment, the industry has created emissions factors that are sort of average emissions rates or leakage rates or whatever for this equipment. And a lot of the reported emissions are actually calculated, estimated emissions based on industry data. That's a state inspector out in the field. I'm not sure what he's doing, but inspectors do go out in their pickup trucks. Jim and Tom may remember better. I think between NMED, the Environment Department, and the Oil Conservation Division, the state may have 30 inspectors and 30 pickup trucks. And we have 58,000 wells or something like that. So it's tough. There are also companies can put in sensors around facilities, around equipment. There are a couple of companies now that sell services to producers where they'll install methane sensors and report emissions or problems to the operators. There's a company called Kairos. I think they've changed their name, but there are some companies that operate drones. An important thing to remember here is that for drones and aircraft, it's the companies that are paying. It's the producers that are paying these methane measurement companies to go out and monitor their operations. There's not universal requirements by regulators to use this technology yet. It's sporadic, and that's one of the things I'll be recommending at the end of the talk. So, Chevron, Exxon, whoever, they'll hire a Kairos or something. Could you do a survey of operations and tell us how we're doing? Similar with aircraft-based monitors. They'll fly around the oil fields and measure ozone precursors as well as methane. And then you all probably are aware EDF put up a satellite and gathered data for maybe 9 months or so. That satellite went out. There are other scientific and national, international satellites, and then there's a group called Methane Mapper, another NGO that has a satellite. So there's remote sensing, and there's a different scale and scope. I forget the word for that. What's the word, Tom, for the
No granularity.
granularity? Thank you, of what you can see from these different kinds of equipment. So how are oil and gas methane emissions being reported to regulators? Here's one of the problems. They're self-reported. The data is gathered by the companies, by the producers, and they are reported by these guys. And as Jim always likes to needle me, would they cheat? And I think we'd all say if they needed to, if they wanted to, probably. So there's regular reporting to the EPA for now, has been for a while, and to New Mexico's Oil Conservation Division. So the next section, I'm going to talk about what gets reported and how it gets used. The EPA has a program, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. It's been in place since 2010. It's got its problems. It's a comprehensive data set, and it's consistent they try to keep it consistent over time as they change methodology. It's self-reported without verification. A big loophole is a reporting threshold. Anything under 25,000 metric tons CO2 a year is not required to report. That excludes small but very numerous oil and gas sources. Our EPA currently is trying to repeal this program, and we'll see what happens with that. But there are any number of news reports. I put the Financial Times up here. Anytime scientists go into the field with any kind of equipment, they find much higher emissions than what the EPA GHG program reports for the Permian, or for anywhere else for that matter. So now we're going to talk about the system that's been instituted for a long time by the Oil Conservation Division within the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. For many years, they've had spills reporting and then venting and flaring reporting. Those preceded the 2021 methane waste rule. The spills reporting, it's a form C-129. This is really what the agency uses for compliance and enforcement. This is my personal gripe. This is the cross that I bear, is what I'm about to talk briefly. And the spills reporting is venting or flaring caused by an emergency or malfunction or of long duration that lasts longer than what the rule establishes. And so when an operator is venting or flaring under these conditions, they have to file this report, and the agency tracks this. You'll see here a press release from 2003. They did a major bust. They busted 6 companies. I think they got $9 million in fines. It was great headlines, great enforcement action. They were using the spills reporting, the prior reporting. This slide on the left, the 115B, did I skip? What have I done here? So I guess I don't have a slide for the total venting and flaring. Sorry about that. This original venting and flaring reporting was simply aggregate venting and aggregate flaring monthly by operators. So Exxon, Chevron, whoever would have to say, this is how much we vented from everything. This is how much we flared by everything. Originally, it was combined. It was both venting and flaring. Then the legislature required OCD to split them out. Then this system got put into place, the 115B, by the methane rule, the methane waste rule in 2021. And this was an extremely detailed, extremely comprehensive system that the OCD director at the time fully supported. They understood the importance of measurement, monitoring, measurement, reporting. It's venting and flaring separately. So venting and then flaring by month, by operator, by source. And I just want to highlight here, measured or estimated using the calculations in industry standard factors. So sometimes the operator's out there with a device or a monitor measuring a flow rate or actual emissions or waste or venting. Sometimes they're just guessing. The main sources of emissions they're really four: storage tanks, associated gas flaring, pneumatic controllers, and I'll get to the fourth on the next slide. So these are the big dogs. And in theory, the operators are reporting all of this data. And let's see what I have next. The reporting requirements don't cover leaks, and that was the fourth source. And leaks are regulated by NMED, the Environment Department. So I'm just going to try to touch on why this is important again. If the agency wanted to track, say, illegal flaring, they would be able, using this data set, to see how much an operator is flaring every month by this category G, and they'd be able to track that. And if that flaring grew or stayed steady or venting and persisted over time, they would have a way of knowing that they were in violation of the rule. Whereas back up here in the spills reporting, it's only periodic. It's not continuous reporting. The operator only reports it when it happens according to the category, the requirements of this data set. So I can talk more about this if there are questions. Unfortunately, the agency, because this data set is enormous and complicated, and I'm not sure why else, I've been chasing this for years, they don't use this data. This data remains an untapped vein of information. The OCD rule also has a 98% capture requirement. What does this get us? Most companies say they're already there. And yet when inspectors or NGOs like Earthworks go out into the field or they use remote sensing technologies, they always find substantial levels of emissions. The pictures on the right are from an optical gas imaging or FLIR camera. And if you go out there with the naked eye, the tank looks fine. If you put an optical gas image camera on it that records methane, that sees methane, that tank's thief hatch, there's probably, they have to measure by manually for older tanks how much oil is in the tank. Often those hatches just get left open, and that's what you see. So I'm sorry for the resolution on the progress to date. This is a slide from MNERD that recently made a presentation to the advocates about the progress with enforcement of the rules. 88% of operators reported in July of 25 that they've reached the 98% gas capture rate prior to the deadline of this coming year. And in terms of production, you can see OCD claiming that increasing levels of production up to 99% of production the gas is captured. And these are just, maybe kind of, but the data is just not that great. Methane emissions reporting, the third program is the Environment Department. And the Environment Department, they have an ozone precursor rule, which was passed in 2020 as well, 2021, pursuant to the governor's executive order. And this went after ozone precursors, but it captured methane, because methane, when you control for an ozone precursor, you also are controlling for methane. So they're getting it, even though it's not explicitly regulating it, because at the time, the state didn't have the constitutional authority to regulate methane. It does now. The NMED rule doesn't really do reporting like the OCD, like the Oil Conservation Division. They rely on inspections and enforcement. So it depends on company compliance with the pollution control requirements for emissions of ozone precursors, including methane. and it's enforced through monitoring and inspections, guys in trucks and remote sensing, or women with trucks, hopefully. NMED is now using satellites and other technology in addition to field inspectors, and boy, have they found them. Last year, they did a major bust. They joined with the old good EPA. They used aircraft. They sent a whole bunch of planes over the Permian, and this is just a striking headline. They found potential air quality violations at 60% of Permian oil and gas facilities inspected. So, this is the counter narrative to the claims of the agencies when they say everything's fine. Recently, NMED's consolidated compliance and enforcement in a new division. And I'm pretty happy about this. I'm confident, I'm hopeful. It's going to increase the effectiveness. Compliance and enforcement people used to be in each bureau and each division. They were spread out all across NMED, and now they're together. And they every month they put out an enforcement watch alert where they talk about and list enforcement actions, what they've done, what they've resolved, et cetera, et cetera. The Oil Conservation Division, which is specifically regulating methane waste from the oil and gas industry, does not do anything like this. And it's a lack of transparency. It's a problem. So here's the reporting takeaway. The administration does not systematically aggregate and track data from available methane emissions reporting systems to determine how the state is doing to meet needed methane emissions reductions. What do? They use the New Mexico Greenhouse Inventory. And that's a modeling exercise. They do their best, uses a combination of emissions data from EPA, greenhouse gas, NMED, wherever they can get it, probably EDF and other NGOs. And they periodically put out an emissions inventory. We got one last year, and we're going to probably get another one this year. The state updates its inputs to the inventory, and last year they revised the oil and gas numbers. You'll remember the bar chart at the beginning of the slideshow where the baseline emissions got higher than the original estimates. That's because of this revision of the oil and gas inventory. The agency recognizes, to their credit, NMED recognizes that oil and gas is a special case within the sector-wide emissions inventory, and I'll show a slide with the sector. So they spend special attention, special resources to try to figure out what's going on in the oil and gas industry. Again, because of that 38% contribution. Here's the problem. Here's how they address the existing policy environment. The inventory assumes full compliance with the state's current rules. So when they do their modeling, they assume that every operator is complying with every provision of the ozone rule and the methane waste rule. They're all being 100% A students. And that's why you get this disconnect between the field studies and what they're reporting, because it's just a heroic and deeply flawed assumption. And I don't blame them. From a policy standpoint, the governor and her administration wants to stand behind what they do, but they're really not there. So another critical slide, this is from the inventory, and I'm getting close to the end. This is the statewide inventory picture. So you've got all of the sectors of the economy on the left-hand column. You've got the 05 baseline. You've got a 21 inventory. You've got the 2025 inventory, which I've been showing slides from. You've got the forecast to 30. And then you've got that we're going to meet the 45% goal. I'm going to move these. Yeah. We're going to meet the goal and be at 45% in the very last column. And what I've circled in red are the two rows that are oil and gas. And you can see that electricity and transportation are significant contributors, but oil and gas is still, the big dog. And I love dogs. I don't mean to trash dogs. Um, a very interesting thing about this inventory is the methane row. You can see in '05, 24 million metric tons, and watch how steeply in this inventory and forecasting it drops, right? That's the paper exercise of getting to, we're getting there, we're doing it. Oil and gas industry is reducing their methane emissions. How real is that is the question. Combustion, on the other hand, is stuck. Part of the, and you see that the '05 inventory, it was at 14.8 and grew. Part of that is because they had shifted from venting methane to flaring it, because CO2 is less of a climate pollutant than methane. But waste is waste, right? So whether you're fending it or burning it, you're losing the use of that gas. And so you see that combustion and flaring has increased. And there's a pretty heroic assumption between the 2030 current policy and the 2030 mitigation of dropping that venting somehow, or that combustion by half. What I don't know is how much of the combustion emissions, the CO2 emissions, are flaring of methane versus the other sources of combustion in the industry, which is, gas-fired engines, right? Or oil-fired engines. So out in the oil field, to move the gas or oil through a pipeline, you've got compressors, ungodly, unimaginable number of compressor engines. And then in processing plants, you've got ungodly, gigantic compressor engines and other kinds of diesel or gas equipment running all the equipment in these gigantic gas processing plants. What's driving the forecast for lower methane emissions? Is it flaring instead of venting? Is it more pipelines getting the gas to market because of LNG? These are solutions we don't like, but it's having this effect. What other assumptions are in the inventory? But we know that this isn't really what's happening in the field. It's not the full story. So the administration is going to be releasing a new climate action plan and an inventory in December, this coming December, next month, a roadmap for agency action to drive additional GHG emissions reductions. It will be Governor Lujan-Grisham's last plan. She didn't do too many. I think she did one or two in her 6 years. Oh, well. But she's doing it, and it'll be available for the new governor and the new administration, and we'll see if this work continues. For oil and gas, the Climate Action Plan is going to identify proposed new oil and gas, methane, and CO2 emissions reduction measures. A likely feature of that's going to be electrifying the oil patch, which I have mixed feelings about. All of the fossil fuel driven equipment, most of it, even drilling rigs, can be electrified, can be electric. But when you have that, you are where's that electricity coming from? How, and this is Southwestern Public Service Company, SPS, which is a subsidiary of Excel out in the Permian. How committed are they building their system with renewables, growing their system with renewables opposed to gas? Total digression, but they're not committed. They're talking about 1,100 megawatts of gas. I think that's right, Tom and Jim. So that, electrification's a mixed bag, and also building new electric generation facilities. You're committing to 20 or 30 years of a piece of equipment's useful life, and so you're really making an investment commitment to the oil patch to keep producing. So, there's no free lunch, and electrification makes my brain melt. NMED is going to be modeling all the measures for potential reductions, and we'll be able to see all of that in this action plan and the new inventory. Another wrinkle here is that the state plan implementation was going to be supported by the Inflation Reduction Act, which was well funded, and a lot of this work has been funded by that. It's gone. That money's absolutely gone, and now we're going to need state funding. And will the legislature prioritize that? Will that money be there? So, what's next? Solving the methane problem. And here are just a few policy ideas. that we can work with. Advocates need to push the legislature to fully fund the oil and gas regulators to get good data, to have good monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification systems. They talk about it. They know they need it. Legislators talk about it. We still don't have it. I started working on this with the Richardson administration in 2012. We knew we needed this then. We still don't have it. We passed a rule to do it. We still don't have it. It's hard. It's expensive. It takes people. It takes money. We need to get this done. NMED and OCD must adopt new rules to require the oil and gas industry to measure and report emissions. So in addition to having the money, they need a good rule, an enforceable. Maybe they'll just take the existing rule and work with it. Maybe they'll make it better. And I put in the side there, Colorado recently, last year I think, did a very tight. I haven't studied it thoroughly, but they've got a very tight rule about actually measuring methane emissions. The industry is very good at saying why you can't do that. It's impossible, blah, blah, blah. Third thing is the state needs to increase transparency and better report progress towards its climate core goal is 45% below 2005 by 2030. Just reporting the results of the inventory modeling exercises, it doesn't work for me. And hopefully it doesn't work for others, and we can work on that. And then there's some rulemakings in the works. NMED has been encouraging, talking about they're going to do this in 2026, in the last year of the governor's term. They're going to do a fee rulemaking again. I'm sorry, a fine rulemaking again, so that they get money when the industry's in violation, and that money will go to the agency for enforcement, and it'll take pressure off appropriations process. And then very importantly, they're going to have a new methane waste rule and a new methane rule at NMED to fill the existing rule gaps with the best from the EPA's methane rule. The EPA passed a great methane rule during the Biden administration. It went after super emitters. It imposed fees for excess methane emissions on operators. But the new administration is in the process of repealing that rule. And so if New Mexico and Colorado and a few other states can adopt the best from those rules, they'll be there when we get a better federal administration in the future. That time will come. So thank you for attending. That's my presentation, and I stand for questions.
Thanks, Tom. Very good talk. Got a few questions in the chat. You might want to stop sharing your screen so folks can see you answer. I'll just read off the ones that we had. You asked first, what does SCADA stand for? Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. That's
Thank
what
you,
it is.
Tom.
So, and Jim asked, why are we so focused on methane?
Yeah, I didn't put any slides on that. Jim, do you want to answer that? Because you can do it just as well as I can. Or I'm happy to.
Let's just hear from you, Tom.
It's 30. If my memory serves me, methane is 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and oil and gas contribute. It's the largest share of man-made or industrial source of methane emissions, and it's short-lived in the atmosphere, but it has a tremendous global forcing. It's 86 over a. So it's carbon dioxide lasts 100 years in the atmosphere, methane lasts 12 to 20. But in that 12 to 20 time that it lasts in the atmosphere, it's 86 times more powerful as a climate pollutant than carbon dioxide. So you get big bangs for the buck in the near term when you keep methane out of the atmosphere. And it's 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gas pollution. So it's just a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah. And that's really the answer to the second question which is why was it important to separately report venting and flaring.
Right. Venting is raw methane, flaring, and I didn't speak to this, but flaring is not a perfect technology. EDF has done great research um, looking at flares, and they go out and they don't burn completely. So, your perfect flare where you're getting 95, not perfect, you're near perfect 95, 98, 95% combustion rate flare is not the industry standard. Um, and you get flares that are not working properly and incompletely combust methane, so there's still methane, or you get pilots that go out and they turn into vents, and there's a lot of them. I think EDF found in one of their surveys that 10% of all flares in the Permian were malfunctioning.
Tom, the another interesting thing, we all see pictures of flares. There was one, in some of the introductions, and you see a typical flare has this big yellow flame. That's a malfunctioning flare. A flare that's functioning properly has a blue flame like it does in your kitchen.
Mm.
You can't hardly see it, and it doesn't make a very good picture. So what we routinely see is malfunctioning flares, and there's lots of them, so it's not hard to find one to take a picture of.
Yeah. There was a question from Jim about what's the scale of the oil and gas infrastructure in the Permian Basin, and I actually found some data and put it into the chat, so I can read that off, Tom, if you'd like.
Please
Um,
do.
yeah, there was a report to the LFC when they were looking at the setback rules. And the LFC reported that New Mexico, as well as being the second largest oil and gas producer in the country, produced 15% of the state's oil as of February 2024, averaging about 2 million barrels a day of oil production. And we have currently 73,000 active oil and gas wells in the state, with nearly 100 active rigs drilling new wells every month.
So if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
from those drilling sites, you have gathering systems that are basically PVC plastic pipes that gather the production. So there's two kinds of production going on in the Permian. Well, let me start over. The Permian is a gassy basin, so there's almost always gas and oil coming out of these wells. In the Permian, there are probably not a lot of companies that are strictly gas producers. That's more what goes on in the San Juan. They're mainly oil producers. And so out of a well, you get a separator, you get tanks, you get all this equipment at the well site, and there'll be two sets of lines leaving the well or trucks. One's got the oil, the other's got the gas. And then, of course, there's wastewater and the crap from the tanks and all that stuff. The gas goes into these gathering system feeder lines, which step up through compression into larger and larger lines until you get sort of high compression natural gas transmission lines. They're not as big as the interstate natural gas transition system, but they're big, and and depending on how far the gathering systems are from the processing plant, you'll have compression stations all along the way to boost the compression, and then they get to a natural gas processing plant. And then you've got a big honking gigantic industrial facility out in the middle of the desert in the Permian with tons and tons of equipment. They're giant facilities. So it's not just, in addition to what Tom talked about, you've got to go all the way through that upstream production chain and think about all of that equipment with all of those connections, all those fittings and pipes screwed together, and all the controllers and all the equipment on them. Some of them deliberately venting methane because that's how they work. Others just leaking because they're sloppy and their operators don't really take care of them, et cetera, et cetera. I think Jim was recently down there, and it's just hair raising.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If I'm sure some of you have been down to the Permian. Um, around Carlsbad. It's ubiquitous down there. Um, but if you get a chance, go down and take a look because it gives you both a sense of the scale of the industry down there and the sense of the scale of the pollution problem. Um, it's the people who live down there
Mm.
live in proximity to these wells. The health effects are enormous. I had a friend who had a produced water line going through her property that ruptured and sprayed her couple of acres and her farm animals and her house and everything with this produced water, which is, really nasty stuff. And that's kind of happens all the time, all over the place. Just it spills into the air, into the soil, into the groundwater, and so I think here we're focused a lot on the large scale problem, which is the climate, which is a great thing to be focused on. But the frontline communities, both in the Permian and in the Four Corners, of course, are getting the impacts immediately, a much shorter timeline than the climate. So it's um, anyhow, don't get me started. Sorry.
More questions.
Yeah, there were two more questions. And Denise, I'm going to read your question, or you could read it yourself if you'd like.
I'm happy to read it myself if
Go,
I'm audible.
go
Um,
ahead. You are.
I'll maybe add to it a bit. I guess the question, the governor will soon be history, and we have an upcoming legislative session in which we can talk about financial matters. How high would a tax on methane have to, on reduced illegal methane have to be to make a difference in the policies of these companies? Did EPA get that far before I assume
Yeah,
their necks were chopped off? And does any other state do a tax on methane emissions?
not that I know of.
Okay.
If there was one, it would be Colorado, but
Yeah.
I don't think they're there yet. The challenges with this, to do a methane fee, you have to have accurate measurement, precise
Mhm.
measurement of, you have to have a precise definition of what is subject to the fee, what's illegal, what's excess.
Mhm.
And then you have to have precise measurements so that you can impose that tax. And hopefully my talk has given you some feel for how difficult that is. Um, but the EPA was in the process of implementing their methane fee. If I remember correctly, EPA measures methane as metric tons, not CO2e, or, the industry measures it as MMBTU or cubic feet, MCF or BCF. So, it's just alphabet soup in terms of measurement metrics. Um, but if I remember correctly, the initial methane fee was $900, let's say an MCF. I just don't remember the unit, but yes, they came up with a dollar amount. Um, and it was going to increase over maybe 5 years to something like $1,500. It was going to be a very steep penalty. And,
Mhm.
and I know that they spent a lot of effort trying to figure out how much. So what you have to think about what the oil and gas company can do to stop venting or flaring, right? What are they going to do? And what's that comparison between, are they going to do that or are they going to pay the fee?
Yes. Yeah.
A quick anecdote. Um, BLM had the authority since forever to require operators to pay royalty on wasted gas. So the Carlsbad regional office many years ago got pissed off at the industry and said, we are deeming all venting and flaring wasted gas. You have to pay royalty on it. So I don't remember how they measured that, because when oil and gas comes out of the ground at a well site, it doesn't actually go through a meter until it goes through all the processing, the separating, the heater treaters and all that, and it goes through a meter at the border of the well pad. But somehow they figured out what was being wasted before it got to the meter, and they were charging operators a royalty. You've got to pay royalty. This is the
Yeah.
public's oil and gas. You got to pay for it. No operator ever did anything except pay the royalty. They were happy to pay $15 or $18 for wasting that gas. What the EPA did with this rule is figure out the dollar amount that would get their attention
Yeah.
and be more cost effective for them to install equipment, build a pipeline, leave the gas, re-inject the gas, put it back in the ground or whatever, then pay that fine. It was steep, and we would have to borrow those analytics.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
whether, can we get the legislature to do this? There are other people that have more insight onto that. And I don't know, if Mimi Stewart's Clear Horizons bill passes and the NMED gets authority to regulate greenhouse gases, would that authority extend to this kind of fee? I would leave that to the attorneys in the room to see if the law gets us there, and hopefully it does.
Thank you.
Thanks, Denise and Tom. One more question. This is from Maria. How about capping orphan wells? How much of a difference in the emissions rate will it make if we get them all capped? And I noted that there are over 60,000 abandoned and orphan wells was reported by the legislature in the state of New Mexico. So it's a big number. What do you say, Tom?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a huge problem. Add a zero in like Ohio and Pennsylvania for the number of orphan wells. It's really scary. There are a lot of national NGOs that are on this issue. Of course, plugging orphan wells is great. The problem is that the plugging material shrinks over time. Like, it's not as permanent and wonderful solution. And when people go out and survey abandoned wells and capped wells, it's not a perfect system. There are startups, companies in New Mexico, at least one I know of, that hopefully the SIC's invested in, or some of our public venture capital money is going to, that have new technologies for improved ways for longer duration plugging. The feds put money into this. Ben Ray Lujan and in particular supported funding for this. I doubt the new administration. I think I read the other day that they cut abandoned well plugging funding. So if federal money is going away and the oil and gas companies aren't required to do this, and the state is starting to become less wealthy than they thought they were, where's that money going to come from? So I guess, Maria, yes, this should also be on my list of to-dos. That I think what did OCD just do a rulemaking on abandoned wells that well led? I think they did. Some, maybe we'll get better rules, better implementation, better technology, and those emissions will get controlled.
Tom, there's a kind of a corollary, which is talking about stripper wells and how they operate in the regulatory milieu, and their pollution contribution, and how they move from being stripper wells into being orphaned wells and that whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll try to organize my thoughts. Some of you may remember the name Harvey Yates. There's this cowboy oil and gas, the family oil and gas well, the mom and pop oil and gas well myth. And there probably are a few in the Permian still, small holders and small operators. The population of oil and gas producers that have to register with OCD is something like 450, 500 companies, entities that are recognized as oil and gas producers. There's only about 100 of them that are big enough to notice, and there's only 30 of them that are probably responsible for 85% of Permian production. So, it's an interesting distribution. the political power of the independents. So there's NMOGA, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and then there's the independents. And they love to go to the legislature and the governor and whine and complain about the mom and pops. Once upon a time, at our urging, OCD identified stripper well ownership. And a stripper well is a well that produces, geez, I think it's I don't remember, but let's say it's 60 barrels of oil or less gas of oil less a day. Maybe it's 15 and a certain MCF of gas a day. And it's not a lot, it's a little. Um, and the distribution of ownership of stripper wells, Hillcore, multi-billion dollar independent, private equity company, barely regulated, primarily in San Juan, but they recently acquired a whole bunch of wells in the Permian. They own, I forget what it is, like half the stripper wells in the state, like 5,000 stripper wells. And then the next two or three stripper well owners are private equity, a company called ICAV and a company called Simco or something like that. And they're these, KKK, Blackstone, you pick your private equity giant, and they're milking these crappy dying assets for their last profit. And the problem is how much maintenance, how committed to maintaining the equipment on these wells. How are they protecting their margins on these wells by neglecting, maintenance, right? So I've not seen information about how much methane or carbon dioxide, let's just talk about methane, how much methane is coming from stripper wells, how big of a source are they? Um, but there are a lot of them, right? There's just a whole lot of them. And so the incentives are all there for them to be problematic. And the politics are there for the true mom and pops to go up to the roundhouse in their cowboy hats and cowboy boots and whine about the regulations going to shut them down when they're really just fronting for and protecting some really big, the worst of private equity investors.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was the end of the questions in the chat.
I appreciate everybody sticking with it.
Yeah, great talk, Tom. It's very informative and eye-opening, and to make us want to do better because this current situation is completely unacceptable.
Like electrification being a mixed bag, to the extent that the market for natural gas is still committed to climate action, whether it's in Europe or Asia, there's still going to be pressure on Permian producers to document that they're producing cleaner than they otherwise would. So as much as we hate pipelines and as much as we hate LNG terminals and much as we hate export of US, I don't know, hang on to your wallets when you get your gas bill this winter because gas has tripled in price almost. The market may push the operators to be cleaner than they otherwise would, even though the system is still working, not on behalf of the climate. But I'm just trying to be hopeful that, these regulatory systems can clean up this mess as long as we still have to live with it. But thank God we have Tom, Solomon, and Jim to teach people that this can all be done by solar and wind and storage, and we don't need any of this fossil fuels
And geothermal.
and
Thank you,
geothermal.
Tom. Jim, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, so I'll say it again, but these evenings are only possible by the people who show up and go off into the weeds with us. But as I think you can tell, that Tom Singer's knowledge and thoroughness is essential to making the next legislative session and the ones beyond it being meaningful and not allowing the governor to jet around the world talking about how green our our gas is. And it sometimes you think maybe she's just on a marketing campaign rather than, I get cynical. I think, Tom, you should be complimented on your restraint tonight. I go way beyond my data all the time, and you seem to hold the reins, and that's great. So it's good discipline. We will continue the speaker series in December. We don't have a topic yet, but we've been doing this for like 5 years, and hope you enjoy it. I hope you come back. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Jim.
everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone. Good night.